Well, welcome back to my channel. My name's Charles from Charles in Photography, and if you're new here, I actually do a lot of videos on basic photography, how to use your camera, all the settings inside the camera, how to take panoramas, how to take sunsets and all that. Most of the time at the end of my videos, I actually ask people if they have a photography subject that they'd like me to cover to leave it in the comment box below, and I would actually try to do a video. Well, today's video is just on that. I've had a few subscribers ask me saying, we only shoot in JPEG. Can you show us how to set up our cameras so that we just shoot in JPEG? Don't want to shoot in RAW, just want to shoot in JPEG, and the photos that come off the card we could just take, share on social media, or just print. So today we're going to go through how to set up your camera. I'm using a Nikon, but if you're using a Canon or a Sony or a Pentax, just go through your manual and you should find the similar settings in your camera. So today I'm using my Nikon D500 with a kit lens, the 18 to 140mm lens. Now I've done a review on this lens and it's linked up here. And a lot of people bag this lens, but used correctly, it will actually get you some very sharp images. Now, it doesn't matter if you've got an entry-level Nikon or something like the D500. All the settings that I talk here, you should find them in your camera. Apart from active delighting, I don't know if that setting is in the base models like the D3000 series. But anyway, we'll just go through and we'll cover all the settings, how to actually set up your camera. And then, as you can see in the scene behind me here, I'm actually going to take photos with all the settings to actually show you what these settings look like and how they actually affect your photos. Because if you're just using your camera, when you bought it from the shop, it's set in JPEG, but it's just baseline, standard, and the pictures will look very flat, very boring. You can actually get some outstanding photos in JPEG. And believe me, when I travel with my family, most of the time, like, I could be taking a couple of hundred photos and I don't want to be editing each of these photos. So I shoot in JPEG and RAW. And when I get home, I just look through all the photos and I might choose just 2 or 3 or maybe 4 photos, the best ones, edit in RAW. And then all the rest, I'm actually just going to leave them as they are and just share them to social media. Because most of the time people, they just want to look at it on Facebook or whatever and go like, beautiful, you know, they can see what we were doing. No need to edit a couple of hundred photos when you've been on holiday. So this should help you out. So the first thing we start off with is the camera modes. Now the camera modes are auto, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. Auto is basically that. It's a green dial and the camera does everything for you. And I've been doing photography workshops for many years now, and the first thing I teach people is to get off auto, because auto will never give you consistent photos. It's just designed, it just looks at it and goes, yep. And I can guarantee you, if you take 10 photos of the same scene, those 10 photos will not all be the same. The first stage to get off auto is called program mode. Now program mode is like you're just starting to ride your bike. You've got your training wheels on to help you. So the camera can still do everything for you, but you can actually control some of the settings. So you could say, okay, well, I don't want to shoot in auto ISO anymore. I actually want to set my ISO so I can control the amount of noise and all that. I can actually get a clearer picture. And then once you've mastered ISO, you could say, okay, well now I actually want to set my aperture, or I want to set my shutter speed. It lets you do that in slow steps. Then when you're confident enough, you can say, okay, you can say, now I actually want to go a little bit further. So we have shutter priority or aperture priority. In Canons, it's AV for aperture priority and S for shutter priority. So shutter priority is great for active stuff, wildlife, sports and all that. When I shoot wildlife, birds and all that, I like setting the minimum shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. Basically, that's a shutter speed that'll start giving you freeze frame. And then if the bird's flying around, I might shoot at 1,000th or 1,500th of a second. For example, if you're in the park, you've got your kids running around on bicycles, setting a faster shutter speed will actually freeze frame. You won't get blur in your photos, so the images will be nice and crisp, and the camera looks after the amount of light that you need in your photos. So the next setting is aperture priority. And aperture priority, you're telling the camera you want so much depth of field. That's what you're after. So it's great for landscapes and all that. And even portrait photographers, they like using aperture priority because they can say, I don't want much depth of field. I'm just focusing on the subject. So they will use an aperture of f4, f2.8 to really blur the background out. But for landscapes, we actually like quite a bit of depth of field. So we'll choose an aperture around f8, f11. And the camera looks after our shutter speed. The next one along is manual. Now in manual, you're telling the camera, I know what I'm doing. So you've got to set the shutter speed, you've got to set the aperture, you set the ISO as well if you want. Now in shutter priority and aperture priority, you can also set the ISO manually, or you can actually tell the camera to auto ISO. So the camera, if there's low light and it can't reach your setting, the ISO will climb up. But most of the time, it's quite good to actually leave it on a fixed ISO, let's say ISO 100, ISO 200. For wildlife though, I actually shoot in auto ISO because if I've got low light, then I know I'm still going to get the settings that I want, but just at a higher ISO. Our next setting is white balance. Now white balance, especially if you're shooting in JPEG, is key because if you use just auto white balance and the clouds come over and all that, the light can change very dramatically. And from moving from a bright area to a dark area, your white balance will change also. So you could actually end up with quite a few different colors. And it's good practice to actually set your white balance manually in JPEG, unless you're confident that the light isn't going to change. Now in white balance, we normally have incandescent, which is great for nighttime. It gives a very bluish tinge. Then we have fluoro, which is great for indoors. Then we have sunny, perfect for a day like this. You set to sunny and it's going to give you basically what you're seeing here. Then you have cloudy, then you have shade. Now, if you're late in the afternoon and it's a bit of a boring scene, but you're saying like, oh, I would just like to add some warmth in the image. Well, then choosing a setting like cloudy or shade will actually warm up your photo. And you'll see that in the photos when I take them. And then the last one, on some cameras, you can actually set your white balance manually to a Kelvin. So I normally shoot in manual white balance when I'm out doing sunsets and all that, because I can actually dial in the amount of warmth or the cool down the photo. In astro, if I'm photographing the Milky Way, it's a definite. I actually shoot in manual white balance and I set my white balance to actually exactly what I want. I like shooting at what I see is what I get. Picture controls are great because they're similar to white balance. Not that they control the color, but you can actually set the mood and feel for your photos. So you've got quite a few different picture controls. You've got standard, you've got vivid, you've got portrait, you've got landscapes. So for example, let's say we're out here and we want a very natural scene. So we set landscapes and it'll just saturate the image just that slightly to actually make your image much more interesting. If you're like picture postcard photos, like you're at the beach and you really want that blue sky, the blue sea, the beautiful white sand, then you would select a mode like vivid. Then you have portrait. Now portrait is great when you're photographing people because it actually tones down your skin colors a little bit. And then you have like standard, which is just run of the mill. It doesn't do much to your photo. But I tell people like landscape, vivid or portrait is very good. There's one last one and it's called flat. And now we normally don't discuss the flat setting too much because flat was added on some cameras basically for video recording because it means it doesn't add any saturation at all. So when you're actually doing a video, you can actually go home and actually calibrate your video. You can actually set the amount of saturation you want, the amount of sharpness you want in your image. So it's actually a fairly flat profile and you'll see that in the photos. Now our next setting is active delighting, and this is great. It only affects your JPEGs. So if you're shooting JPEGs and RAW, it does not affect the raw file. Like all the other settings, they don't affect your raw file. What you're seeing on the back of the screen here, even if you're just shooting in RAW, is actually just a JPEG thumbnail of all the settings that you've applied. But in JPEG, what you're seeing is what you're going to get. So active de-lighting is great for early morning or late afternoon. Like at the moment here, you can actually see we've got some trees in the background here. There's quite a bit of contrast difference between the shade in the trees and the bright sky. So active de-lighting helps in this. So it tries to balance out a very bright sky to a very shady area where the trees are. And it sort of draws out the shadows, but then tones down your highlights as well. And you've got quite a few different settings in active de-lighting. And I'll show you this as well, all the different stages of active de-lighting. I actually use active de-lighting just on normal, because if I'm out and about doing a workshop and all that, I'm shooting in RAW and JPEG, and I just share the JPEG images, and they've got that sort of added bonus that I don't need to do any editing, and the active de-lighting just sort of controls my image a bit more. Now the last setting we're going to cover is exposure compensation. So when we're shooting in shutter priority or aperture priority, if, like you see in the background here, the sky's too bright, you're taking a photo and you're like, oh, it's just too bright. Well, there's a little button here and there's a little plus or minus. Sometimes it's on the side of your camera, sometimes it's on the back, but you just have to look for the little button, and on your manual it'll tell you where the exposure compensation button is. And what that means is that you don't have to change your settings. So for example, if I'm shooting in aperture priority for a scene like this, and I've set my aperture to f8, the camera's worked out the shutter speed, but I can notice that the sky is actually blown out, then all I have to do is press the exposure compensation and then you dial it down. And you can see, as soon as you press a little button, it actually shows you a 0. And if you turn the button to the left, it actually goes into minus. So it'll actually darken your image. If your image is a bit dark and you want to brighten it up, then you turn the dial to the right and it actually increases your exposure. And this is the only way that you can actually control your exposure properly if you're shooting in shutter priority or in aperture priority. In manual, you don't need exposure compensation because you're actually adjusting your shutter speed and your aperture accordingly, so you'll always get your correct setting. Now I'm actually going to put my camera on the tripod and take the scene that's behind us here with all the settings that we've discussed, with the camera modes, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, white balance to show you all the different white balances, picture controls, all the different picture controls you can have. And I'll also take with exposure compensation. So the first image will actually be quite dark because I'll set it to -1 EV. So it means I'm telling the camera I want one stop of light less, then I'll take a photo with the correct exposure, and then I'll take a photo with one stop of light too much, and you'll actually see that that photo will be blown out. So now let's go and take some photos. Then I'll go home and I'll put all these photos on the computer, and I'll actually show you what these photos look like, and we'll just discuss the settings a little bit more. Now that I'm in my home office, I've downloaded all the photos that I took of all the camera settings, the white balance, the picture controls and all that, and now I will show you on the computer what all these photos look like and the settings and the shutter speeds and all that these photos were taken at, so you can get an idea of what the photos look like with all the different settings being applied to your JPEG images. So the first camera settings that we looked at were the camera modes, program mode, shutter priority, aperture priority. So these are the photos taken with the camera modes in program, shutter priority and aperture priority. So in program mode, this is what the camera dictated. With the amount of light we had, it gave us a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second and an aperture of f9, which gives us a good amount of depth of field. So in shutter priority, I set the shutter speed to 1/400th of a second, and the camera automatically set the aperture to f9. Now if I was shooting birds in flight at 1/1000th of a second, the f9 would be greatly reduced, most likely down to around f5.6. Now here, In aperture priority mode, I've set the f-stop at f9, and the camera in reverse has actually set my shutter speed to 1/400th of a second. Now these are the photos that affect our white balance. So these are all the photos, and you will see the differences between all of these settings. So the first one is auto, and the camera works out what it should give you. The incandescent setting, this is a very good setting for astrophotography late at night. It is a very cool, you can see for daytime it's just way too blue. Now fluorescent, like we talked about during the first part of the video, this is a very good setting for shooting indoors. And I also like using the fluorescent setting when I'm out and about photographing the city lights at night. It actually gives it just that right sort of color tone. But you can still see here, it's still quite cool. Now this is the mode that I normally shoot in, direct sunlight, if I'm shooting during the daytime. You can see the colors are very well balanced. The blues aren't too blue, the greens are just right. Now we didn't cover this setting. The white balance flash setting is, I tell people, mainly used exactly like this, flash. If you're putting a flash on your camera, if your camera has a little pop-up flash and you're using that to take photos, then set your white balance to flash and you will find you will actually get very accurate colors. The next one was cloudy. Now cloudy, all that does compared to direct sunlight is it just adds a bit of warmth to your image. As you can see here, it's just getting a bit warmer. In the first part I said, like, if it's actually quite dull and you actually want to warm up the image, then the shade setting is perfect for this. And you can see this in this image, that shade actually warms up your image quite a lot. So late in the afternoon, if there's no colors around, you can actually warm up your image by setting the white balance to shade. And the last setting is manual white balance. Now this is the white balance that I normally use when I'm out and about and I want accurate colors. Some of the cameras will actually allow you to set the white balance manually, so you can actually cool the image down or warm the image up as much as you want. So if your camera has this and you're shooting in JPEG, this actually lets you get a very fine control over your white balance, over how the colors in the image are displayed. Now our next camera setting are picture controls, and like I stated in the first half of the video, picture controls actually helps you get the sort of developed photo that you want. Do you want a fairly flat image? Do you want a very vivid postcard look? If you're shooting people, then shooting in the portrait mode actually softens the skin colors, doesn't add too much contrast, and it looks really good. So we'll take a look at these photos now. So this is the standard picture control setting. You can see there's not much done, and basically this is how the camera comes from the factory in the standard setting. And this is neutral. You can see it's actually even a bit flatter. There is very little contrast in this. This means that the image will look very flat when you print it. On the other hand, you can see vivid setting is very good if you want that picture postcard feel of your image. You're at the beach, you want the skies blue, you want the beach nice and golden. This is a very good setting for you. But I find it's just slightly overdone for my taste. And this is monochrome. If you like shooting black and white, this is a very good setting to use. It'll just shoot photograph in black and white. Now this is the portrait setting. This is the one that I was saying that was very good when you're photographing people or groups of people. The next one is landscape. Now this is the one that my camera's set on. I like shooting in landscape. It gives me the best of both worlds. It's around halfway to vivid, but a little bit stronger than the standard profile. But it's not oversaturated and there's not a lot of contrast and sharpness added to the image. Now, like I mentioned in the first half of the video, this setting, the flat setting, is only used really when you're shooting video, because there's not a lot of contrast added, there's not a lot of color added. So when you get the video home to edit, you can actually add the amount of contrast, the amount of sharpness, the amount of color saturation that you want in your video. Now remember, what I said active de-lighting does is it tries to control your highlights and your shadows and balances it out. So if there's a lot of shadows in your image, it tries to bring them up, And if the image, like let's say this sky here, is actually quite bright, it actually tries to reduce the highlights so that you actually end up with a much more even image. And there is quite a few settings to this. So this is with active delighting off. This is in low, and you can see it's just starting to do its job now. This is with normal setting. This is with high. This is extra high. Now, even though the image got a little bit darker, you can see that it's much more balanced. So if you're shooting in aperture priority, all you would do is just use exposure compensation, which we're going to talk about very soon, and you would just increase the brightness of the image just slightly, and it would be a very well exposed image. And this is on auto, so you're telling active delighting just to try to work it out, and you can see it hasn't really done a good job here. It's just all over the place. The sky is very bright. Now I will just play back all the settings so you can actually see how these actually affected the image. So we'll start with off. You can see low, normal, high, extra high, and auto. Now remember, the last setting we discussed was exposure compensation. Now at the start you might be a little bit confused about exposure compensation, but I just tell people to go out and have a bit of play with exposure compensation, and you will soon understand what it does. One thing that you have to remember is when you're using exposure compensation, that you turn the camera off, the settings are still there. So when I teach people about exposure compensation, I tell them if we're facing in one direction, as soon as we stop taking photos and move on, we set the exposure compensation back to 0. Because if you turn around, let's say if we're shooting towards the sun and all of a sudden we see that there's a beautiful setting behind us and we turn around, our images are going to be totally off with exposure, because we've actually set exposure compensation for very bright sky, and then when we turn the other way, the sky will be much darker, so our images will be underexposed. So before you move, reset your exposure compensation to 0. This is exposure compensation set to 1 EV less light, and you can see here our shutter speed is 1/640th of a second, f9, ISO 100, and we were shooting in aperture priority. This is the correctly exposed image. You can see 0 EV, so it's correct exposure, and look at our shutter speed. It is correct at 1/320th of a second. The aperture stays the same. With 1 EV more light, look at our setting. It is 1/160th of a second, half of 1/320th. And you can see now that the image is well overexposed, exposed by one stop too much light. So exposure compensation works that if you're wanting to brighten the image, you have plus 0.3, plus 0.7, then plus 1. And they will most of the time go to plus 2. So after 1, it's plus 1.3, 1.7, and then 2. And if you're wanting to darken your image, it's the same thing. Minus 0.3, minus 0.7, minus 1, and so on until you get to minus 2. So now that you've seen what these camera settings, what shutter priority, aperture priority, program mode, in the camera modes, and what all the white balance settings do to your photo, and also all the picture controls, it'll give you an idea of actually how to set up your camera for different situations. And like I said in the first part of the video, the more you get out and about and play with these settings, the more confident you will be to actually take that great photo. Everything takes time. Kids don't learn to ride a bike on their first day. They have training wheels. It takes some time. The same with getting to know your camera. So I hope this video has helped you understand how these camera settings, white balance, picture controls, exposure compensation, active delighting, can help you take better images, better JPEG images, that there is no editing involved, and you can just take it to a camera shop, print them, or just download them and share them to social media. And this is the beauty of photography, that we can customize our cameras to our heart's desire, just for our own use. So you can set up the white balances that you want, you can set up the picture controls, and understand that in the picture controls, let's say portrait, landscape, vivid, If it's not quite right for you and you want to modify them a little bit, read up on your user manual and you will find that you can actually modify these settings for your own use. If I lent my camera to my mate and he went to use it, he'd most likely look and go like, well, I really don't like these settings because they're designed for you. They're not what I want. But that's all right, because I've set my camera up for myself, not for anybody else. If this video has been helpful to you, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and if there's a photography topic that you'd like me to discuss, just like this video on setting up your camera, leave it in the comments box below and I'll look at actually doing such a video, because this video was actually asked for by quite a few of my subscribers. So this is why I did this, to actually help my subscribers and help you as well understand how to take better photos in JPEG. I'm Charles for Charles in Photography. See you next time.